Most people have heard about cryptocurrencies and NFTs, of course, but most people also don't appreciate that these are but two examples of many different types of digital assets. Blockchain gives us the ability to express ownership and transfer ownership of digital assets. Digital assets are a fundamental building block of the Web3 world. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. I am your host, Doug Heintzman, and I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. In this episode, we're going to explore the world of digital assets and try to better understand their role in the emerging business landscape. And to guide us on this journey, I am delighted to welcome Alex Tapscott to the podcast. Alex is the Managing Director, Digital Asset Group at 9 Point Partners. He is the co-author of Blockchain Revolution and the editor and co-author of Financial Services Revolution and Digital Asset Revolution. Alex is also the co-founder of the Blockchain Research Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Well, happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Throughout this series, we've been kind of exploring, what W3 is, what Web3 is all about, and what blockchain's role in that is. And one of the themes we always kind of keep on coming back to is that, blockchain's ability to enforce digital scarcity and to keep an immutable record of transactions, what we call the state, that really it's a big deal. And amongst the things that it enables are these things that we're calling digital assets. And in the parlance of blockchain and Web3, we call them tokens. So, I'm wondering, can you help us, just before we really kind of dive into this, help us understand what a digital asset really is?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was actually a terrific introduction, Douglas. Basically, what we're dealing with now is sort of a new era of the web. That's the way that we think about it at the Blockchain Research Institute, and that's the way I think that more and more people are, viewing this new industry, which is that for decades we've had an internet of information, and that's been great for moving and storing information, for democratizing access to information, but it actually wasn't very good for moving and storing assets. And that's because the internet was not really ever designed to program scarcity. So when you send someone information online, whether it's an email, you tweet something, you blog, or post something online, you can create copies of it and send it to someone else. Now, that's great when it comes to information. It sort of democratizes information, but when it comes to things that have value, it's a big problem. And basically what's required is for people to be able to trust that when they receive something of value online, that it's the only one of its kind. And that's the double spend problem that no doubt many listeners have heard about. That's been very tricky. And that's been solved thanks to the invention of blockchains. Blockchains are, really the back end for Web3 and for digital assets. They are decentralized ledgers that give anybody the ability to see and verify that transactions are final and accurate, and that the things that they own, they actually own. And that's, big innovation. So digital assets themselves are manifestations of digital scarcity in Web3, and they can really represent just about anything. If you think about, the website as sort of the killer application for the first era of the web, and maybe, blogging or file sharing is a killer application for the second era of the web, then when it comes to Web3, really it's tokens that are the killer application. And if a website is a container for information, a token is a container for value or a container for assets. And it can contain basically anything of value. The first iteration of blockchains, the first killer app would be Bitcoin, which is designed to be a form of currency, a way to store value and to move money that's not reliant on governments and banks. And that's a really interesting use case, but it's one of many use cases. The token as a container can be programmed to hold just about anything. And this is something that we spent a lot of time researching at the BRI and have included in books and papers and speeches and the like, trying to help people understand just what exactly that taxonomy of digital assets looks like.
Okay, so let's start there. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of the audience has, of course, heard about cryptocurrencies, and you mentioned Bitcoin being one of them. And they've probably also heard about NFTs, which is, has been, quite a bit of hype about for the last year and a half or so. So those are obviously two types of digital assets, but you mentioned a taxonomy. Can you kind of fill in the landscape? I mean, so we've got cryptocurrencies and we've got NFTs, and we can circle back and kind of explore those in a little more depth. But just before we do that, what's the broader landscape look? Give us some examples of some of these tokens that you're referring to.
Yeah, well, a token can come to represent just about anything. And I think that it's important not to get overly focused on what's out there today. Oftentimes when there's a new technology, the first iterations of that new technology are what they call skeuomorphic. In other words, they resemble things from the era before that technology existed. So with the internet, a lot of the early examples of, web pages and email, online catalogs, classifieds, et cetera, these were all things that existed before they were just moved online. So what we're seeing in the digital asset space is a lot of the early examples are things that are trying to sort of recreate what existed previously. Having said that, we've done the analysis and basically concluded that if you look at the entire market size of all digital assets, they fall into one of 9 different categories. So I mentioned, and that's the taxonomy that I was referring to. So I mentioned cryptocurrencies. Money is something that's very specific in what it's trying to do. It's trying to be a medium of exchange and a store of value and a unit of account. And Bitcoin, I think over time has demonstrated that it's a store of value, if not a volatile one. And it is a medium of exchange. Whether or not it ever becomes money in the way that, dollars are money, we'll see. But that's one of 9 different categories. The other categories are things that would be familiar as well to people who are, coming at this from a traditional perspective. One example would be something like a securities token. So a securities token is a digital asset that represents security, and a security can be any financial asset, right? So something like a stock gives you a share of a common enterprise. A bond, it gives you, stream of cash flows and the promise of a repayment down the road. Any of the business logic of assets in traditional markets can be programmed into digital goods, right? So that container could include shares. The container can include bonds. Another thing is a stable coin. A stable coin is a digital asset that tracks the value of some other asset in the traditional world. Most typically, it is a currency like the US dollar. So there's about $150 billion of circulating supply of stable coins, and almost all of that tracks the dollar. But there's no reason why it couldn't track something else. Facebook launched a project called Libra that was intended to basically be a global currency backed by a basket, and they ran into some problems with the government and had to abort that. Interestingly, the founding team from Libra are now out with their own project called Aptos, which is already a top 50 project in the space. So maybe a missed opportunity by a Web2 legacy company. But stablecoins really are designed to be payment system that uses digital assets. So for global payments, it can take days, sometimes weeks, to settle transactions between people, depending on their banking relationship or lack thereof. And stablecoins allow people to move money in the form of dollars, peer-to-peer, and instantly in a matter of seconds. So there are huge opportunities inside of digital use cases in the digital asset world, but also more in the more general sense for the economy as a whole, for moving money around the world, right? Whether that's between businesses on different sides of a border, people on different sides of the border, doesn't really matter. Another really interesting asset that we've spent a lot of time on are called natural asset tokens. So natural asset tokens are a way to tokenize some physical good in the real world, typically a commodity. And one really interesting example of this is carbon. Carbon is something that is created by virtue of burning fossil fuels. It's the big externality of industrial production and of transportation and so forth. And it's also the thing that is warming the planet. And if we don't do something about reducing the carbon in the atmosphere, then the world might become inhospitable for large parts of the population. So this is the kind of thing that we need to sort out right away. There has been a real sort of lack of consensus around carbon credits. There are various different standards in different parts of the world, and there's no sort of global registry. Well, a blockchain is a decentralized ledger of transactions that is globally accessible, is trusted, that anybody can access, but no single entity, can alter or manipulate. And that kind of technology is a really great basis for creating a global decentralized carbon registry, right? So there are lots of really interesting projects, many of which I think are going to be actually presenting at W3B on this very subject, which is how can we use Web3 tools like tokens to solve global problems? How can we use them to create a market solution, perhaps, to something that until now has not had a way to be captured by a market? And that to me is really exciting as well. Some of the other kinds of assets in the taxonomy that are not skeuomorphic, they're not based on the way the world used to work, but rather on something really novel and new, are things like governance tokens. So a governance token is the native asset of a decentralized application. And so what does that mean? So basically, a lot of Web3 projects and applications are trying to recreate or do better what traditional software does today, but in a decentralized and trustless way. And basically all that means is that they run on a blockchain. They don't require a central party to act as a trusted intermediary, and they're difficult to shut down or to censor, right? So anything that is, centralized and domiciled somewhere and has a trust and acts as a trusted third party is it can easily be shut down or censored, and that's true in lots of different parts of the world. So these decentralized applications are sort of, by their nature, exist as software. And so they need a different kind of way to represent value. Instead of shares, they use this thing called a governance token. And a governance token basically gives holders certain economic rights and as well as certain say into how a piece of software is run. And what's different about governance tokens compared to, say, shares in a company is that by being an early adopter of a new service, you can actually earn a share in that very thing. A good example of this is, when I was 18 years old, Facebook was invented. And I was one of the first 1 million people on Facebook. And, I joined Facebook and I've befriended hundreds of people, and I started to, update my profile. This is before the news feed, but, I was posting stuff and adding content. And, in no small part because of me and millions of other people who were doing something similar, college students in the US at the time, we helped to create the network effects that made Facebook really valuable. And in the end, we didn't get to participate in any of the upside. I mean, we got access to a free service, but Facebook still harvests my data, still resells that data and still looking for ways to exploit it. And I didn't get to sort of own a piece of that thing without buying the shares in the company when it went public. I didn't get a say in how it was governed. And I think that's a model that could use improving. And so that's what Web3 applications promise to do, which is that if you're an early adopter of a platform, you can earn a share of that platform. You can have a say in how it's run. And I think that's a really innovative and quite novel development that I think will help a lot of these applications grow and compete with their more centralized counterparts. So I could keep going, Douglas. There's lots of other kind of tokens.
Just as far as you've gone there, just once again to help us set the table here, so to speak. In your taxonomy, there's a bunch of words that I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, right? Bitcoin, Ether, BNB, Tether. Can you just help us slot each one of those into one of those buckets just to give us a touch point for them?
Sure. Say them one more time. BNB, Tether, and what?
Bitcoin, Ether, BNB, Tether. Those are the top four, crypto assets out there.
Great. Yeah. So let's start with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. It is designed to be a digital store of value and a way to move money peer-to-peer. It was originally designed as peer-to-peer cash, but I think has morphed over time to be sort of gold for the digital world. If gold was this commodity that had no intrinsic value but was scarce and hard for governments to control, then Bitcoin has a similar sort of role and domain in the digital world, right? Okay. That's, I think, the easiest.
What about Ether? Why is Ether different?
Yeah, Ether is different because from the get-go, Ether was designed to do more than what Bitcoin does. So you can think of Bitcoin as a single-purpose technology. The Bitcoin network and the blockchain that is the back end for the Bitcoin network is designed to move and store Bitcoin and to do so securely and peer-to-peer. And it does that really, really well. But that's all it's designed to do. A lot of people looked at Bitcoin in the early days and thought, hey, the idea of peer-to-peer value transfer and digital ownership is really interesting. Why don't we try and program the Bitcoin network to do other stuff? We'll develop these things called colored coins, where we'll take Bitcoins, but we'll color them and we'll program them to do different things. So maybe they can do shares in a company. Maybe they can do natural asset tokens or stable coins. And all of those projects failed. And the reason for that is simply that the Bitcoin network was never designed to support those kinds of applications, right? It's like trying to call up, get an Uber ride on your pocket calculator. Those just incompatible kinds of technology. So Ethereum emerged as a potential solution to that. And Ethereum was designed from the beginning to be a general purpose platform, meaning that you could program any kind of asset to be moved and stored and programmed on top of the network. So the protocol, it's called a protocol token versus a cryptocurrency. So the Ethereum network has a native token called ETH. And you can basically think of the Ethereum network as, a vast city grid. And on the city grid, there's all these different applications that are running. And those applications are like the cars, right? And one car is moving securities, another car is moving natural asset tokens, another car is moving stable coins, another one is moving NFTs, and another one is running a on-chain video game, which is a popular new application set. And in order to run all these cars on the network, you need fuel. And so Ether is known as gas on the network. And basically, you fill up the car with Ether, and that allows you to run transactions on the network. It's basically like a transaction cost, but instead of being paid to an intermediary, it's being paid to the network as a whole. So the network is growing in size, and stakeholders in the network are participating in that upside, but it's not a centralized intermediary that's capturing all the value. So if you think about the Ethereum network, if Web3 applications grow and become super popular and drive millions of users and enterprise adoption, all things, by the way, I think are occurring now and will continue to occur, then the demand for the gas to run those transactions, to fuel those cars, is going to increase. And if the demand goes up while the supply remains fixed, the price will go up. So that's like the investment case for Ethereum. People sort of see a relatively fixed supply, but a clear demand pull coming from all this Web3 application development. So that's protocol tokens. So I hope that sort of draws a clear distinction between something like Bitcoin, which is really a single asset token. Something like BNB is a bit of a hybrid because on one hand, it was created by a company called Binance, which is a centralized exchange, and the token has tons of utility in that centralized exchange as a way to, you earn tokens, for example, by doing transactions. You can use those tokens to get access to better deals, better liquidity. You can use it as part of a referral program. So really, it's kind of like a loyalty point on steroids in that respect. But Binance also has developed its own blockchain called the Binance Smart Chain that uses the BNB token in the same way that Ethereum uses the ETH token, right? So it's a bit of a two-sided coin. And that's why it's so extremely valuable. As an exchange token, I don't know how valuable it would be if that was its only use case. Probably about, I would say, half as valuable. Today, because it's also supporting lots of applications, it's able to capture more value in the same way that Ethereum has. And then you mentioned the final thing, Tether. Tether is a stable coin. It's a US dollar stable coin. It's designed to hold a peg to the US dollar, and it's used as one of the three dominant stable coins in the blockchain ecosystem, and now increasingly is used as a way to move money between individuals and businesses across borders, in addition to its use case in the digital asset world. One company that we work closely with at the Blockchain Research Institute, for example, helps multinational companies operating in markets in Africa basically repatriate dollars to the US, and they do so using stable coins like Tether, for example. So it's not just something that's used in digital assets, it's something that's also used increasingly by enterprises as well.
Okay, so in that description, you talked about BNB as being kind of a bit of hybrid, and I've been watching the phenomena, and I was sitting having dinner with my son, and he's sitting there with his Robinhood application, and he's trading, Ethernet. Or it's not Ethernet. He's trading. My goodness, that dates me. He's trading Ether, back and forth, maybe 5 or 6 times while we're having dinner, and. And he is actually a Web3 person and really fully understands it. But I think there's a lot of people out there that are going in and out of these positions, or at least have been for the last few years, that really may not even have any idea about the fact that something like Ether is a utility, token, and it actually is an internal currency that's used to pay for network resources to execute application logic. It's more of a speculative asset that, they're kind of in and out of sort of quickly. How does the intersection between the fact that this digital asset has, an intrinsic value in terms of being able to spend it to execute business logic on this big distributed network, and the fact that there's so many people interacting with it that simply view it as a transactional speculative asset, does that help the situation or hinder it? I mean, does it inflate the cost of running things on the network unnecessarily, or how do you see all that landscape?
Yeah, so that's interesting. There's a few different ways to look at that question. So I think that speculation is, by and large, like a net positive. It's in the same way that, interest in owning shares of a hot startup or company can help that company to raise capital and become, to grow and be successful. I also think, however, that it helps, it hinders the industry and the ecosystem in the mainstream media because it conflates utility with speculation. I think a lot of people, to your point, just assume that this is, just a big casino and everyone's sort of gambling by buying tokens and hoping that they go up. And obviously there's a lot more going on behind the scenes and a lot more intrinsic value that's being created. In terms of your final part of that question, which is, does it inflate network costs? I haven't actually done like the definitive research on that, but my instinct would be no. And the simple reason for that is that gas fees are a function of demand for state, that thing you mentioned earlier, a demand for block space. So if you've got a network that has like a fixed amount of blocks that are getting created and those blocks only fit a certain number of transactions, if there's tons and tons of demand for block space in those different blocks, then you're going to see gas fees increase. But just buying and selling Ether, most of which, by the way, happens on centralized exchanges like Binance by speculators, is not actually contributing to the demand for gas to run transactions on chain. However, that issue that you raised, which is there greater congestion in those blocks, is an interesting one, because what's happened in the Ethereum network is largely it's been a victim of its own success in a way and has become extremely congested. And as a result, the fees on the network have increased. Now, this could be transitory, to paraphrase the Federal Reserve. Gas fees could go down as the network becomes more robust, which is something that is in the roadmap. But at least until then, a lot of people are looking at other protocols to support application development and to support transactions. And that's why we've seen projects like Solana, for example, or even Binance Smart Chain, BNB, capturing value away from Ethereum recently. And then I would just finally add that, when it comes to speculation, I think it's easy for people to dismiss what's happening in a lot of these different assets because of the sort of eye-watering valuations they see in some of the headlines. And I think that's especially true in NFTs. There's lots of different NFT projects that have become popular with internet personalities and celebrities where they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on, scarce cartoon versions of themselves or some other figurine. And, I think in general, people can spend money however they want, but I think for a lot of outsiders looking in, they see that as validation that this is speculative mania. But what's unfortunate about that is if you go beneath the surface, that's like a tiny fraction of the $23 billion market in NFTs, at least over the last 18 months, that is actually creating all sorts of really creative and interesting ways for creators to capture value, for game developers to rethink ownership of virtual goods, and all sorts of other applications. And so I do think that it's up to us, and it's incumbent on us at the BRI and people who are in the space trying to educate people to help them distinguish between the speculative use cases, valuable as they might be, and all of the other use cases, which I think is where the real action is. So
I'd like to dig down into that in a little more detail, but But before we do, just in terms of, making sure that everyone understands kind of what the vocabulary is, a lot of people have heard about NFTs. And NFTs is just an initialism that, that stands for non-fungible token, right? Which, of course, kind of suggests that there's something called a fungible token. So just in terms of educating us, can you just give us a quick description of what the difference is and why non-fungible tokens are different than fungible tokens?
For sure. So NFT stands for non-fungible token, and it's a classic example of this industry choosing just the least appealing kinds of words to describe things.
So you called it something different in Blockchain Revolution. You called it
a crypto collectible.
A crypto collectible.
Crypto collectible,
but which
is a good word. It is, but at the same time, it doesn't totally capture all the utility of an NFT. It describes one kind of use case. So I actually think NFT is a better term. We just have to ignore it. It's like people don't know what TCP/IP stands for. We just got to move on from it, right? So an NFT. So if you think about assets like Bitcoins or dollars or shares in the company, if I've got $1 and you've got $1 and we swap those dollars, it doesn't really matter to either of us which dollar we have because they have the same value. They have the same, utility, right? They're fungible. If you have a share of Apple and I have a share of Apple, I can choose to own any common share of Apple. It doesn't really matter which one. With NFTs, it's different. So there are lots of assets in the world where being unique or very scarce is actually important to the value. So for example, art, like the Mona Lisa is not fungible. You could trade a Mona Lisa for a Rembrandt, maybe, but the Mona Lisa for Rembrandt, maybe, but you're not trading a thing that is of the same kind, right? So it is a distinct asset. So there are lots of kinds of assets in the world that are distinct from each other. In fact, there probably are more assets that are distinct from each other than ones that are of a certain kind. So where we've seen most of the applications in NFTs are in things like art and collectibles, which makes sense. If some artist creates a one-of-one digital painting and wants to sell it, an NFT is a useful way of creating an authentication. The buyer knows that that's the authentic version. And it's also true. NFTs are being used as well in, virtual worlds. Like if you've got a character that you play in a video game that's got a whole bunch of specific attributes that are unique to that person, then that character can be an NFT. But an NFT can also be stuff that's a lot more boring than that. Like the title to a home. Every house is different. There's a market for houses, but they're not totally fungible. One house is different from the next house. And so NFTs can be a way to represent title of assets like houses. They can be used as a way to represent title for assets like loans. A lot of loans are bespoke and unique. There's lots of terms that are different from the next loan. They can't trade one for the other. And so loan agreements and other sort of financial contracts can also be represented in this way as a programmable NFT. And then, of course, the biggest use case, in my opinion, is actually using NFTs for identity, for digital identity. Mona Lisa is non-fungible and art is non-fungible. Another thing that's one of one is you and me, right? There's no other you, there's no other me. And so NFTs, for example, are being contemplated for use cases such as soul-bound tokens. So SOUL bound tokens. What does that mean? Basically a non-transferable, non-fungible token that is assigned to every individual at birth and over time accrues all sorts of information about that person. Their birth records, health records, their financial information, other aspects of who they are as a human being. And that is data that they control, that's sovereign to them, but then allows them to, open up all sorts of things in the world, right? To open a bank account, to, buy a house, to travel the world, to get access to healthcare and so on and so forth. So NFTs, and again, this is one of those things where I'm describing mostly the use cases for NFTs today, art, collectibles, maybe a few bespoke assets, financial assets, but ultimately it's going to be really interesting to see how they are deployed, over the next few years for some of those other use cases, which are not commercialized yet, but I think ultimately could become extremely important. Yeah. So,
you just hit on, I think, kind of the big question here is that, while having these digital assets sounds like, this is a very powerful primitive, right? It's a building block that we can use in many situations and build all kinds of interesting systems on top of them. You just talked about a very important kind of use case, which is the digital identity use case. And I can well imagine all the various different configurations of systems that could leverage that kind of token and create a lot of value. And I know there's geographies. I think is it in Korea or Japan? They're making a really big push around this, and they believe that about 3% of their GDP will be the economic value of their digital assets. Their digital identity system, which is an enormous amount of value. Yeah. So that's kind of exciting. But I was thinking of some of the other places, and one of the areas that I've been doing a lot of research around is on supply chains. And supply chains, I think the pandemic really exposed just how fragile some of these supply chains are and how rigid they are. And it's become abundantly clear that we need to have a lot more visibility. They need to be a lot more adaptive. And governments are going to want to find out ways of interacting with these systems. So how do you see them playing in this space, and how are we going to incorporate things like, you talked about carbon before, some of the scope 3 externalities? I mean, do you really see it changing that part of our world?
Well, it's a great question, and I can't say for sure. I think ultimately, a token is a digital medium for value. So I think it really does work best when you're describing things that can be abstracted into the digital world. So you've mentioned a couple times, actually some great formulations, which is that these networks execute business logic on a distributed network. And I think that business logic works best when we're talking about intangible things, right? And that could be stocks or bonds or carbon credits, which are ultimately just entries in a ledger. They can also be represent transactions in virtual goods, virtual assets, virtual collectibles, currencies, and all sorts of other things. Where it starts to become a bit trickier, I actually think, is when we're with the intersection of this virtual tool set and the physical world. So the opportunity for supply chains is that there's all these different stakeholders in a supply chain or in a supply network, right? It's not really a chain. And everybody would like to be operating on the same information that they can all trust and know is timely and accurate. And so the idea of having a distributed ledger that has all that information in it, that suppliers and vendors and custodians, custodians and transfer agents and customs houses and all these other stakeholders can see and trust is really appealing. But ultimately, what we're doing is tracking, physical goods. So there's a couple of things that I think where I think there's some questions that need answers, and I'm not the expert on this stuff, just to be clear. But around the provenance of assets, you could say that thing came from the place where it came from, but who's to say that the data that's going in or the product that's going in is in fact the product that you think it is? And then at the end state, when those assets are acquired, everyone can trust that the information is accurate, I guess, assuming that there's some sensor on the device that hasn't been tampered with, right? And so there's all these different things that I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm sure there is an answer, Douglas, but it's almost not really for me to comment on it. We actually have a book called Supply Chain Revolution, which probably answers, I have to go back and revisit it, but probably answers my concerns or questions in far greater detail and more eloquently than I ever could. So maybe that's where you should be directing people to check it out.
That's a great idea. But one point that I think is important is that implicit in what you were saying is that these digital assets have as part of their intrinsic capability the fact that they are programmable, which means that they can be automated. And, it's not just a matter of a supply chain getting greater visibility, but that all kinds of conditional logic can be associated with how assets move around the network. And these things become inherently more intelligent. I mean, the entire system becomes more intelligent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's right. I mean, and then, who am I to say that something is not feasible? It's more just that there's not the creativity to imagine how it could work ultimately, right? And I think that's in a way, that's a convenient cop-out that some people use with new technologies. They say, never confuse the first example of the technology with what it will ultimately become. The first killer app for the internet was not email, or sorry, the big killer app for the internet was not email, it was the web browser, it was as, the web as a communications and collaboration tool. And maybe with blockchains, the first killer app is not necessarily Bitcoin. There are all these other use cases in other industries. But that's true. But also you have to be able to develop the roadmap and into how we get to that point, right? And you have to be able to answer the hard questions and the implementation challenges about how that comes about.
Well, I have a whole long list of questions, and we could continue this conversation for many, many hours. And we have had versions of this conversation for many, many hours. Thank you, Alex. That was really fascinating. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find research on this topic and other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope you'll join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.